Jack's last wish, a homeless man sentenced to death, wasn't for a meal or a phone call. It was something no one expected. He asked to see his dog one last time. But what happened next changed everything. The air in the prison was heavy, as if even the walls knew what was coming. The anticipation of Jack's execution was palpable, but what no one imagined was that the simple presence of a dog could turn the tide of a life. That was all Jack wanted. Nothing more. He didn't ask for food, freedom, or even forgiveness. He just wanted one last look at his faithful companion, Charlie, the dog who, throughout all the years of his life on the streets, never left his side. The request was simple, but the tension was building. Something was in the air, something that no one in the prison could have predicted. But what Officer Richards and the other guards didn't know was that this request wouldn't be just another farewell. Jack's story, and that of his dog, was about to reveal something that would change everything, something no one could have imagined. Before we dive back into this touching story, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Now, let's continue the story. Jack never imagined that the end of the line would come like this. Lying on his cold bed in a dark prison cell, he reflected on the events that had led him here. With calloused hands and a face marked by time and struggle, Jack didn't look like the man he could have been. His empty gaze, full of sadness and resignation, reflected everything he had been through, everything he had lost. He no longer saw himself as a man. He saw himself as a shadow of his former self, a lost soul wandering through a world that never wanted him. No one knew what he had lost, but he did. And perhaps that was the most painful part. Jack had a story that many wouldn't even bother to listen to. He hadn't always been that dirty, ragged man with an unkempt beard, wandering the streets of the city. Before all this, Jack had a life like anyone else. He had family, friends, and dreams. He had a job that kept him busy, a simple but cozy house, and even plans for the future. When he was young, he imagined a bright future. He worked hard, had real friends, and a life that seemed promising. But everything changed when a series of wrong choices and life circumstances pushed him to rock bottom. The first major turning point in his life came when he was arrested for the first time. Jack knew that making mistakes was human, but what happened to him after that was a true tragedy. He was convicted of a crime he hadn't planned, in a moment of desperation. Lost, unsupported, and hopeless, he found himself in a judicial system that seemed more interested in punishing him than understanding him. The circumstances of his arrest, the lack of proper defense, and the pressure to dispose of a case led to a sentence he didn't deserve. But what few knew, what no one wanted to know, was that Jack wasn't a criminal. He had never been a criminal. Jack's imprisonment wasn't just a sentence of lost freedom. It was a sentence of losing everything. He lost his home, his dignity, and even the few friends he still had. The prison became the only reality he knew, and with each passing day, he felt more distant from who he once was. When Jack arrived at prison, the idea of freedom seemed distant. The life he had was gone, and he found himself surrounded by cold walls, unfamiliar faces, and indifferent stares. His transformation from an ordinary man to a homeless convict was swift, almost relentless. But throughout all these years, one thing remained constant in his life: Charlie. Charlie wasn't just a dog to Jack, no. Charlie was his soul, his reason to keep going. Wherever Jack went, Charlie was there. During the coldest days, when Jack could barely find a place to sleep, Charlie was there, his warm body lying beside him, like a silent protection against the cruel world around them. When Jack was on the verge of madness, with hunger eating away at his strength and despair overtaking his mind, Charlie never left his side. The dog, with his unshakable loyalty, was what kept Jack hanging onto a thread of hope. To Jack, Charlie wasn't just an animal. Charlie represented everything he had lost and, at the same time, everything that was still human within him. For many years, Charlie was the only link Jack had to the outside world. He had no family, no friends, but he had that dog. Charlie never asked for anything in return except for food and shelter. Jack knew that, no matter what, Charlie would always be there, waiting for him, like a loyal friend, like a child who loved him without judgment. No matter how cruel the world was to Jack, Charlie always loved him. He didn't care about Jack's flaws. He didn't care about the unfair conviction. He was simply there, with his eyes shining with affection, always ready to give love, without reservations. Now, in his cold and dark cell, as the sound of the clock echoed in his ears, Jack knew his life was about to end. He had nothing left to lose. His fate was sealed, and the only thing he desired, the only thing that could give him any peace before the end, was to see Charlie one last time. Jack no longer had a home to return to. No friends, nothing but a simple request: to see his dog, the only companion he had during all those years of suffering. The prison warden, Mr. Thompson, heard Jack's request, but he seemed troubled. A request so simple, so human, seemed somehow out of place amid so many last-minute requests. Why didn't Jack ask for food? Or for a final phone call? He could have asked for anything, but he chose to see his dog. It made Jack's situation seem even more tragic, even more desperate. As Jack anxiously waited, his thoughts were focused on Charlie. He knew the scene unfolding in the yard would be his last memory before he left. The only thing he wanted was to feel Charlie's presence, the only being that had truly cared for him. The silence in the prison was oppressive. The sound of the guard's footsteps echoed through the walls, blending with the unmistakable ticking of the clock on the wall. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if time was simply waiting to drag someone to their end. Jack knew death was near. He could feel it. With each minute, with each second, he was drawing closer to the moment when his fate would be sealed. Sitting on his bed in his cell, Jack didn't feel fear. Not anymore. Fear, to him, no longer had meaning. He had already faced the worst moments of life: hunger, loneliness, cold nights on the streets, society's rejections. Prison, with all its harshness and limitations, was nothing more than an extension of his former life. However, there was one thing he couldn't control: a deep, almost desperate desire to see Charlie, his faithful dog, one last time. At that moment, a simple request, but one loaded with emotion, began to form in his mind. It was the only wish he had. It was all he wanted before being taken to the execution. And no, he didn't want a meal, a last phone call, or even one last chance to defend himself. Jack wanted something that few, if not everyone, could fully understand: to see his dog one last time. With calm and steady breathing, Jack got up from the bed. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness of his cell, looked at the door with quiet determination. He knew it would be difficult. He knew it wouldn't be easy to convince the guards to accept such an unusual request, but he also knew it was the last thing he could ask for, the last thing that could give his life in prison at least some kind of meaning. With a sigh, Jack approached the bars of his cell and waited. The sound of keys approaching announced the arrival of the guard responsible for his escort. It was the moment. He needed to be firm. He couldn't hesitate, not now. What more did he have to lose? The guard, Officer Stevens, was a man with an impassive face, used to dealing with the prisoners who passed through there. His expression was hard to read, but Jack knew that didn't matter. He was about to ask for something that seemed small but meant the world to him. "Officer Stevens," Jack began, his voice firm but laden with urgency. "I'd like to make a request." The guard looked at him with suspicious eyes, as if waiting for yet another trivial or absurd request. But seeing the seriousness in Jack's eyes, he tilted his head, signaling that he would listen. I'd like to see my dog." "Charlie," Jack continued, each word lightening a weight inside him. He's all I have. And I don't want to go without seeing him one last time." The silence between them stretched on, and for a moment Jack feared that the request would be denied. What more could he ask for on his last day? What could be simpler than this? Charlie's loyalty had been the only constant in Jack's life, and all he wanted now was that simple farewell. Officer Stevens remained silent for a few seconds. Jack knew he was processing the request, The prison had rules, and such an unusual request couldn't be made lightly. However, something in Jack's request seemed sincere, seemed human. What appeared to be a trivial request at its core reflected a humanity that many had lost behind those cold walls. Finally, the guard shook his head and sighed. "You know this is outside of protocol, right, Jack?" Jack nodded, knowing full well. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but the hope of seeing Charlie, of feeling the companionship of his loyal friend, made him persist. "I know, but it's the only request I have left. I just want to see him. I just need this." Officer Stevens looked at Jack for a few more seconds, his eyes softer than before. He knew Jack was going to execution, and perhaps this would be the only moment of humanity he could offer to a man who, deep down, didn't deserve what had happened to him. "I'll try," he said finally, "but I can't promise anything." Jack looked at him with gratitude, a small but genuine smile appearing on his tired face. He knew he wasn't in a position to demand anything, but at that moment the chance to see Charlie seemed more significant than anything else. The next minutes dragged on as Jack waited anxiously. He didn't know if the request would be granted, but his hope was alive. In his mind, he pictured Charlie running toward him just like always, with that look of loyalty and unconditional love. That moment, simple for many, was his chance for redemption, his chance to say goodbye. And finally the door opened again. But what Jack didn't know was that what would happen next would change the fate of everyone in the prison. The request to see Charlie would not just be a farewell. It wouldn't be just a moment of affection between a man and his dog. Charlie's behavior upon finding Jack would reveal something much deeper and more significant, something no one in the prison could have predicted. Jack sat nervously, anxiously waiting. The door to his cell was open and he could hear the heavy footsteps of Officer Stevens as he walked away, likely to fetch Charlie. Every second felt like an eternity. The sound of the clock echoed in his mind, but it was the sound of the door closing that made him feel like the entire world had stopped, waiting for this moment to unfold in a way he could never predict. He never imagined his last memory before death would be something so simple, yet so deeply significant. He had gotten lost in his thoughts, reflecting on the moments he shared with Charlie, when the sound of the key in the lock echoed down the corridor. The door to Jack's cell opened slowly, and Officer Stevens appeared in front of him, a small smile on his face. But the smile didn't last long, and Jack's gaze immediately turned to the side, where Charlie was being brought in by another guard. Charlie was there, for the first time in years, standing in front of Jack. The dog, whom Jack had found while still wandering the streets, was older now, his paws not as agile as before, but his eyes were still shining with love and familiarity. When Charlie saw Jack, an immediate glimmer of recognition appeared in his eyes. He stopped, lifting his head and cautiously moving toward him. Jack extended his hands, feeling the emotion take over his body, but also a sense of nervousness. He felt pressure in his chest, as if something more than just a simple reunion was ahead of him. What he didn't know was that in this moment Charlie's behavior wouldn't just be an expression of affection and longing. Something in Charlie was about to trigger an event that no one in the prison could expect. Charlie moved closer to Jack, but before anything else he stopped for a moment, almost as if evaluating the situation. His eyes locked directly with Officer Richards, who was standing a bit farther away, observing. The dog paused, his nose raised, as though sensing a strange energy in the air. Then suddenly, Charlie let out a low growl. It wasn't just any growl. It wasn't a growl of fear or anger. It was something deeper, as if he were trying to communicate something Jack couldn't understand, but which his instincts recognized clearly. Jack furrowed his brow and looked at Charlie. He knew the dog didn't growl without reason. What was happening? Why was Charlie growling at Officer Richards? Jack's instinct told him something was wrong, but he couldn't understand exactly what. Charlie's behavior didn't make sense. Or did it? Officer Richards, a tall man with a rigid posture, seemed uncomfortable with the situation. He took a step back, avoiding looking directly at the dog. Charlie's reaction, though subtle, didn't go unnoticed. The other guards in the room were stunned, exchanging quick glances between each other. Something wasn't right. Everyone in the room was nervous, but Richards seemed more tense than ever. Jack, his eyes fixed on Charlie, felt his heart race. He knew something was off about Charlie, something in the way the dog reacted to the officer, something that was alerting him to a truth he still couldn't see. Charlie's behavior wasn't random. There was a purpose behind it, something somehow connected to what was about to happen. Charlie's growl intensified slightly, but soon he stopped, as if he had completed his mission. He pulled away from Richards, moving toward Jack, and immediately curled up next to him, as if wanting to protect him from something. Jack petted Charlie's head with his trembling hand, trying to calm the dog while also trying to process what had just happened. He didn't know what it meant, but the instinct he shared with Charlie, a connection only the two of them understood, told him that something much bigger was about to be revealed. The silence in the room was almost palpable. The guards were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, and Richards seemed even more nervous, his eyes darting from Charlie to Jack. There was something about Richards that didn't seem right, something in his attitude that everyone was noticing, but no one knew exactly what it was. Jack looked directly at Richards, trying to understand what was happening. He didn't know yet, but something deep inside him told him that Charlie's behavior had something to do with what had happened in the past. The dog, with his sharp instincts, probably knew what Jack still couldn't comprehend. There was something wrong with Richards, something the guards didn't know, something hidden in the shadows, but somehow Charlie was alerting him to it. Jack knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. Charlie's growl, Richards' uncomfortable reaction, all of it was starting to make sense. This wasn't just a dog trying to protect himself. This was the behavior of a dog who knew something that no one else knew, something Jack needed to uncover. The tension was mounting, and Jack felt his heart beat faster. The prison, which seemed like the end of his story, was now becoming the stage for a twist he never could have imagined. The simple request to see his dog was about to turn into something much bigger. Charlie's behavior wasn't just a simple reaction from a scared dog. Jack knew this. He could feel the tension in the air, the unease of the guards, and the strangeness of Officer Richards' behavior. Charlie's growl, which initially seemed innocent, was now the key to a mystery Jack couldn't fully understand. But somehow, he knew something was about to change. After the dog settled beside Jack and fell silent, the atmosphere in the room felt heavier, as if everyone had been overtaken by a shared sense of discomfort. Guard Stevens, who had been responsible for allowing the meeting between Jack and Charlie, seemed bothered by the scene but didn't say a word. Officer Richards, with a tense face and sweaty hands, started taking large steps toward the door, as if he wanted to distance himself from the situation as quickly as possible. Jack watched everything closely. He knew that the simple request to see his dog was turning his last hour of life into something much more complex. What should have been a simple farewell moment was becoming something much bigger. What did Charlie's behavior mean? Why did the dog seem so hostile toward Richards? Seconds passed, and the feeling of uncertainty took over Jack. He wanted to scream, to question, but he knew he had to be careful. He didn't know how, but something was forming there right before his eyes. Something he couldn't ignore. Then, Mr. Thompson, the prison warden, entered the room. The man, with a serious appearance and rigid posture, observed the scene with piercing eyes. He noticed Charlie's behavior and, without saying a word, made a subtle gesture to the guards around him. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Stevens, unsure how to explain, hesitated before answering. The dog growled at Officer Richards. "I don't know what happened, but it didn't seem normal." The prison warden approached, analyzing the scene. Jack's gaze didn't leave Richards, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Richards was standing further away, trying to avoid Jack's eyes, and Jack noticed that the officer was uneasy, as though he was hiding something. Mr. Thompson's gaze locked on Richards, as though he was assessing the officer's behavior. After a brief silence, he turned to the other guards and said, "We're going to investigate this." That simple phrase was like a snap. Charlie's behavior was now being seen as an indication of something deeper, and the prison seemed to finally wake up to the possibility that something was very wrong. But what exactly? Jack felt, on a visceral level, that there was more at stake than his simple execution. The warden signaled for the guards to take Richards to a more secluded area. With the scene out of view, Jack was left alone, still with Charlie, and the tension grew with every second. No matter how hard he tried to understand what was happening, he couldn't find a logical explanation for what had just occurred. Why had the dog growled at Richards? What kind of instinct had Charlie followed in that moment? And most importantly, why was Richards reacting with such discomfort? What was being concealed? Charlie, at his side, seemed calm now, but Jack knew the dog's behavior wasn't random. He had growled at Richards in a way that indicated something more than just a simple warning. The dog seemed to have a connection with Richards, as if he knew something no one else knew. The silence in the room was interrupted when Mr. Thompson returned, accompanied by other guards. The warden looked at Jack with an expression that mixed curiosity and caution. "Jack, we have reason to believe that there's something more going on here, something related to your case. Mr." Thompson's voice was serious, but there was a touch of uncertainty that Jack had never seen before. "Your dog's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Richards will be investigated. We need to find out what he knows." Jack was silent for a moment. He didn't know what to expect, but the fact that his situation was being reevaluated so seriously gave him a small thread of hope. The investigation into Richards could mean the difference between life and death for him. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to discover the truth that until now no one had wanted to see. I don't understand. What does he have to do with all this?" Jack asked, almost whispering. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know why his dog had growled at that officer. He couldn't stay quiet anymore, not after such strange reactions. Mr. Thompson looked at him with a mix of understanding and caution. "We'll find out, Jack, but we need your help. Do you remember anything that could help us understand what happened? Anything that might have to do with what Richards did in your case?" Jack thought for a moment. He tried to remember everything that had happened in the past, the day of his arrest. Everything that had occurred in that trial he knew was tainted. He had lost faith in the whole process, but in that moment, an idea began to form in his mind. Maybe something had been manipulated, something in Richards's testimony. He couldn't remember all the details, but he felt that this investigation, this small opening, was his chance to finally discover the truth. Whatever it was, he knew one thing. He needed to act quickly. Death was drawing near, but justice seemed for the first time within his grasp. The air in the prison was thick, as if the weight of an entire life was about to be revealed. Jack, with his heart racing, felt as though destiny was pushing him toward something bigger. The investigation into Officer Richards had begun, and the doors to the truth were finally opening. Jack knew that his life could change at any moment, and as he watched the guards and Mr. Thompson walk away, a sense of urgency took over him. Charlie's behavior, that simple growl, had proven to be the key to something Jack didn't fully understand, but he knew something was being hidden. He had been convicted for something he didn't do, and now, with every step of the investigation, he began to wonder if the very prison itself had been a mistake. There was something wrong with Richards, and Jack, though not fully understanding what was going on, was increasingly sure that the truth about his conviction was closer than ever. Jack was called for a brief interrogation. Mr. Thompson looked at him with an expression that mixed seriousness with silent doubt. "Jack, we need you to tell us everything you remember about the day of your arrest. Any detail could be crucial now." Thompson's voice was softer than before, but the weight of his words was clear. He knew he was dealing with something much bigger than a simple execution case. Jack's mind was cloudy, the weight of years of suffering still heavy on him. But as he started to recall the day of his arrest, an idea began to form. He remembered Richard's coldness, the disdainful look the officer had given him as he was dragged into court. Something wasn't right there. The feeling that Richards knew more than he was letting on started to consume Jack. I don't understand why I was arrested," Jack began, his voice trembling. I was just trying to survive. They got me at the wrong time in the wrong place, and I had no defense. Mr. Thompson listened attentively, but his expression didn't change. Do you remember anything that happened in the courtroom? Anything Richard said or did? Jack narrowed his eyes, trying to remember every moment. The memory of his trial was a blur, a process too quick to be considered fair. But one thing stood out. Richards had been the officer responsible for most of the testimony that led to his conviction. And, more importantly, Jack remembered that something about his words had seemed off. Something that now made complete sense. I remember Richards accusing me with such hatred in his eyes. He said I was involved in something much bigger than it seemed, but I didn't understand what he meant, Jack said, trying to piece together what had happened. He seemed in a hurry, like he wanted to get rid of me quickly. Mr. Thompson exchanged quick glances with the other guards, and Jack felt that he was closer to the truth than ever. But he still didn't know how much darker that truth would be. As the details started to fit together in Jack's mind, the door to the room suddenly opened, and one of the officers rushed in. What he said made Jack's blood run cold. "Director Thompson, we found something." Mr. Thompson looked up with expectation. "What did we find?" The officer looked tense, his face pale, as if he were holding a bomb about to explode. "We checked the records from the day of Jack's arrest, and we found a discrepancy." He paused for a moment, letting the tension rise even more. "Richard's report is altered. He omitted a crucial part of the story. His testimony was fabricated." Jack felt the floor fall out beneath him. The revelation was like a punch to the stomach. The officer who had been part of his conviction, the one who had the power to decide his fate, was now at the center of a lie. Richards himself had manipulated the records, hiding evidence that could have proven Jack's innocence. "But that's not all, Jack," the officer continued now with an urgent tone. "We dug deeper. Richards didn't just omit what really happened, but we found out he was involved in other similar cases. He has a history of fabricating evidence to frame innocent people, especially people like you who had no voice." Jack's eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Richards, the man who had ruined his life, wasn't just making a mistake. He was actively part of a network of corruption, manipulating cases and destroying lives. Jack, who had been a pawn in all this dirty game, was now starting to see the truth more clearly than ever. "How do you know this?" Jack asked, his voice full of disbelief. "We managed to access secret prison and court records. Everything had been covered up, but we found a series of inconsistencies in the cases Richard supervised. He was manipulating the proceedings, eliminating any evidence that could clear the innocent, and yet he remained unpunished." The revelation was devastating. Richards wasn't just a dishonest officer. He was part of a larger system of manipulation affecting not only Jack but many other victims who had no strength to fight against a corrupt system. Jack, now completely shaken by the truth, found himself facing a critical decision. He knew he couldn't stay quiet. Richards had cruelly and calculatedly manipulated his life. He had been part of a machine that crushed the innocent, and Jack couldn't let this go unnoticed. "What's going to happen now?" Jack asked, his voice stronger now, but still filled with conflicting emotions. "Now we're going to reverse your sentence, Jack," Mr. Thompson affirmed confidently, finally seeing justice being served. "The investigation is underway. The truth will be revealed, and you will be freed." What seemed to be the end of the line for Jack was now turning into a new opportunity. He still didn't know how things would unfold, but there was something in his heart telling him that, for the first time, he was finally receiving the justice he deserved. The night was falling over the prison, but inside Jack's heart, the sun seemed to rise for the first time in years. Everything was different. The weight he had carried for so long, the constant fear of death, the feeling of being invisible to the world had dissipated. He was finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but the feeling was more than that. He felt as though he was being redeemed, not just by justice, but by something even greater. The truth. Officer Richards was now under formal investigation, and his manipulation of evidence and involvement in crimes that had harmed so many people were being exposed. The system itself was beginning to dismantle, and Jack, unsure of what else to expect, was finally feeling that the weight of the chains that had bound him for so long was being lifted. "Jack, we did it," Mr. Thompson said with a victorious tone, entering the room where Jack was waiting. He no longer looked like the hard man from before. There was a spark in his eyes, as if he finally felt he was fulfilling his purpose. "You will be freed from execution. All the records have been corrected, and the process of reopening your case is being finalized. Your lawyers are already handling it." Jack looked at the prison warden, trying to process the words. He knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time he believed he might finally be free. Free not only from the system that had imprisoned him, but also from the anguish that tormented him for not having had the chance to defend his truth. But despite the gratitude he felt, there was something more Jack longed for. Something that could not be taken from his life, not even by death. He looked at Charlie, who was sitting beside him, watching everything with an impressive serenity, as if he knew exactly what was happening. Jack knelt down and petted Charlie's head, the dog who had always been by his side, who had always loved him without asking for anything in return. To him, Charlie wasn't just an animal. He was the last thread of humanity left in his life, the only being who had never abandoned him. He looked at the dog and, with a peaceful smile on his face, whispered, "I knew you would bring me here. I knew you'd never leave me alone." It was a simple moment, but one filled with meaning. He had never been a man of many words, but that moment was, without a doubt, the deepest of his life. He had been freed not only from the chains of prison, but also from the pain and loneliness that had followed him for so long. The prison warden took a few steps toward Jack. "Now you have a chance, Jack. Justice has been served. You're going to be able to start your life again." Jack slowly stood up, feeling a wave of emotions he didn't know how to control. Something bigger was happening, something beyond the simple liberation from execution. He was being freed for something more important, a chance to rebuild his life, to rediscover his dignity, to make peace with himself. He didn't know what the future held, but hope was finally taking its place in the heart of someone who, until then, believed he would never have a chance. The door to the cell was opened, and Jack, accompanied by Charlie, took his first step out of the prison. The sound of their footsteps echoed down the empty corridor, but instead of solitude, Jack felt a sense of freedom. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew it would be a different path than the one that had led him to prison. He felt that the chains that had imprisoned him had been broken, and now he had the chance to rewrite his story. Charlie walked beside him, his loyal companion, the friend who had never betrayed him, who had always been there, ready to follow him to the end. Jack looked at him with an emotional smile. There were no words to describe what he felt. What more could he ask for? He was free, and that, in itself, was a victory. In that moment, Jack understood that true freedom didn't come only from being physically released from prison. True freedom came from the ability to start over, to leave behind the mistakes of the past and move forward with courage and hope. He knew life wouldn't be easy, but now he was ready to face it in a way he never imagined possible. As they walked out of the prison, the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky in golden and orange hues. For Jack, that was the first true dawn of his life. He looked at Charlie and, with a silent tear running down his face, said, "Let's go together. Now, the two of us will find a new beginning." And so, with Charlie by his side, Jack stepped into a world that was finally giving him a second chance. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing he was sure of: he was no longer alone. He was ready to face the world again, not as a defeated man, but as someone who had found his true freedom. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next ones. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the choices made by the characters? Do you agree with how things unfolded, or would you have done something different? Drop your opinion in the comments below.